Welcome to the Winter Show. My name is Helen Allen. I'm the executive director of the show, and we are delighted to have you here at this year's edition of America's leading art, antiques, and design show. As you probably know, we are not just a celebration of exceptional art and craftsmanship. We are also a not-for-profit organization that is founded by and benefits East Side House settlements. So we're thrilled to have so many seats in the house today because your support here today is actually helping New Yorkers in need. So thank you to all of you. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's panel and panelists, the piece I'd never part with, Treasures for New Tastemakers. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our moderator and a dear friend of mine, Patrick Monahan. Patrick is a Vanity Fair and Country Life contributor and is also a fabulous art advisor and connoisseur. Directly next to him is Cordelia Bourne, co-founder and director of Patrick Bourne & Co. from London. And Harry Gready, director of Benappi Fine Art Limited, also from London. Well, this is London in the house today, except for Patrick. And then Adam Calvert Bentley, founder of Adam Calvert Bentley Antiques. And Patrick said today not only did he want to have an enticing panel that was going to be engaging and dynamic, he said he wanted to have the best looking panel at the show, and I think he delivered. So anyway, thank you all so much for being here with us today. We're thrilled, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Patrick.
Thank you all for coming today. It's a pleasure to be with everybody at the Winter Show on a sunny Saturday afternoon, and to be with three, wonderful luminaries in the London art world. But for me, more importantly, three dear, dear, dear friends who I've been aching to have together in New York, and we've finally done it, so here we are. The title of today's panel comes from an English magazine called Country Life, which I contribute to, and a section in it which is called The Piece I'd Never Part With, where every week someone in the art world or not in the art world is asked to contribute an article about the one work in their collection which they would save from a burning building above all others. My piece is the drawing, which is by Frederick Lord Leighton. It shows, as you can see, late in the day, a woman sleeping in an armchair, shifting from position to position as she just rests, and happens to be captured by one of the greatest Victorian artists, Frederick Lord Leighton, who was the president of the Royal Academy. It also happens to be the first direct study for a painting on the right, Flaming June, which is not only Frederick Leighton's masterpiece, but also probably the most reproduced Victorian painting in existence. Now, I won't talk about the painting in detail because that's not the name of the game today. That's a whole other lecture, and if Helen asks me to come back from an adorable art lecture, I will do it for you, my dear. But suffice to say, for these purposes, it's a woman sleeping in an apricot saffron-colored gown by a sun-drenched sea. She has an oleander flower dangling over her head, which is known to be poisonous. So there are many questions about what this painting is about. Even more tantalizingly, it's a painting which the artist himself, Lord Leighton, never described in writing. The only thing he ever said was it was based on the chance attitude of a weary model at the end of a long day's work. And in the drawing that's with me, it really captures that moment, that initial spark, where a very pedestrian moment, maybe a model not even modeling, just sitting in a chair resting between modeling moments, suddenly became this iconic painting, which really boils down to a circular figure in a square canvas. Tantalizingly, the only sentence that Leighton ever said to describe this painting was it was based on the chance attitude of a weary model. And that word, chance, sort of haunted me over the last 10 years that I've spent with this painting, because the history of it, from the time it was created in 1895 to the present, is just a chain of chances. And amazingly, that chain of chances took me as one of its links, starting, well, 10 years ago and even 15 years ago. I was a student at the University of Chicago, and a classmate invited me, who was from Puerto Rico, and he invited me to spend the weekend away from a cold February in Chicago. And we rented 2 kayaks on the lagoon of San Juan, and we were kayaking. And I suddenly see this enormous billboard with Flaming June on it above the mangrove plants that are in the lagoon. And I was an art history student, so I knew this was a British painting. And I said, what is a British painting doing in Puerto Rico? From my kayak to his kayak. And he goes back from his kayak to my kayak. Oh, there's a museum on the other side of the island. And I forgot about it. I was much more interested in the kayak and everything else. 10 years later, just when I had left the gallery where I'd been working for 9 years and started my own art advisory, and also was contributing to Vanity Fair, I was walking down Fifth Avenue here in the 70s, and I saw exhibition banners for the Frick collection, and they had Flaming June on it. And suddenly I remembered the kayak and Puerto Rico and my friend. I thought, wait a minute, I need to know, why is this British painting on a Caribbean island? And I'll give you the short answer to it. And it starts in 1895 when Lord Leighton painted the picture. He was the president of the Royal Academy, the arbiter of Victorian taste. This is the height of the aesthetic movement, of everything that I'm sure you all know about that I won't go into. But it was also its twilight. Just as Lord Leighton is painting this iconic picture, Victorian society is crumbling. Oscar Wilde is in the thick of his indecency trial in London. In Paris, Paul Cézanne is having his first solo show at Ambroise Volar's gallery of sort of proto-cubist paintings. So it's a world very much in its twilight. Leighton himself was dying. He died within 6 months of finishing this painting. Flaming June totally fell out of favor. She went from one collection to another, going down the line of things. A pigeon died behind the canvas. Nobody really cared, if you can possibly believe it. She even disappeared completely from view until 1963, when the painting was discovered in Clapham Common in London by a builder who was demolishing a house. He found her just behind a wall, a piece of Victorian bric-a-brac, and he sold her for £60 to a local framer, where the framer put the painting in the window, and a young Andrew Lloyd Webber, this is, I know, right? A young Andrew Lloyd Webber is walking down the street with his grandmother, and he asks his grandmother if he could buy it, and the grandmother says, no, I won't have that Victorian junk in my flat. And Andrew Lloyd Webber missed his chance, since he's become the most important collector, private collector in this field, and he's been wanting this picture back ever since. Anyway, the framer sold it to a barber. The barber sold it to a private dealer. The private dealer sold it to a gallerist called Jeremy Moss, who started the Victorian revival in the 60s. And in 1964, a philanthropist, art collector, and a governor of Puerto Rico called Luis Ferre came into the Moss Gallery, fell in love, bought the painting, sent it to Puerto Rico, and it became known as the Mona Lisa of the Southern Hemisphere for his newly founded Museo d'Arte de Ponce. Fine, so we're back on Fifth Avenue. I'm walking down the street. I see these Frick collection signs, and I thought, I have to write this story. So I wrote the story. Came out in Vanity Fair, and I wrote the story without ever seeing the painting in person. So I go to the preview, whatever it was, and I'm standing in front of the picture, and I say out loud to the universe, isn't this the most beautiful painting in the world? And the stranger who's standing next to me says, yeah, and did you read the beautiful article that just came out in Vanity? No, it gets so much better. It's so much better. Did you read the beautiful article that just came out in Vanity Fair? I said, I have to confess I wrote the beautiful article. And she said, I have to confess my grandfather bought the beautiful painting. I said, what are you doing for lunch? We had lunch, and it started a friendship, and now I advise the museum. We've been lending Flaming June to museums like the Met, the Royal Academy over the last few years. The museum is unfortunately closed because of severe earthquake damage, and we're rebuilding. So it's really this chain of chances which unfolded. With the drawing, specifically, I was in this is, I guess, 2017. I was in a rickety taxi in Greece with my mom and a specialist from Christie's who knew that I was obsessed with this painting by now. He said, "We have a drawing coming up for sale. Do you want to buy it?" And my mom overheard. I'm like, "I don't have the money." She's like, "Get it." And I went to London to the sale. I had a great boss at the gallery where I started, Achim Muller, would always say, if you really want something, collectors take note, go in person, get it in the room, do it. And I did it. And the irony was I was sitting next to someone who's become my wonderful friend, whose head I can just see in the back, Rupert Moss, who's Jeremy Moss's son, who sold the painting to Louis Ferré in 1964. So there's a wonderful, just as this is a circular composition and my drawing has 3 circles, it's the circle of this chain of chances, that brought me friends in New York, in Puerto Rico, and in London from people who I see now quite regularly as I go. So I'm happy that we're all connected. And that's my piece I'd never part with. Now,
well, that's quite hard to follow because it's a wonderful story. But my story with my favourite painting, which you can see over there on the screen, which is by William Nicholson, it's called The Brass Canister, and he painted it in 1917. My story begins as a student in London of art history in 2004. And obviously I kept up with all the exhibitions that were going on in London at that time. And there were some big names that year. There was Jasper Johns at Tate. There was a big survey of Dada. There was Richard Hamilton. And then at the Royal Academy, there was an exhibition of an artist called William Nicholson. And I had never heard of his work. And a fellow student said to me, "Oh, well, that's Ben Nicholson's dad." And Ben Nicholson, most people in this room will probably know, is one of the most sort of famous British modernists. And the exhibition poster was this beautiful painting of a lustre bowl with some green peas on a white cloth with a black background. And it was rich and luxurious and very intriguing. And I went off to the show. It was full of the most ravishing paintings, still lifes, portraits, landscapes, cities, interiors, most of them quite small, and they just refused to fit into any of the main narratives of early 20th century art history. This was an artist who seemed to think that there were enough possibilities in representational painting to detain him indefinitely, and they were inventive and witty. And they sort of cast a spell on me and I fell in love with his work. And sort of 15 years later, I work for a gallery where we handle a lot of William Nicholson's paintings. We buy and sell them for people. And this came through the doors and my husband and I decided that we couldn't let it go. And it was a big commitment for us, which we don't regret. If you look at the brass canister over there on screen, it's as if it's there, isn't it? And it's been done so effortlessly. It's as if he's just sort of floated it onto the canvas. And it's not hyper-realism like a Golden Age still life, but it is high realism. But it's not finicky or laboured. As I said, it's just so effortless. And then you've got these beautiful, it's a slightly fuzzy reproduction, but these beautiful leather-bound diaries. They're so tactile. It's obviously an incredibly beautiful picture, but there's this sensuality in the tactility of everything. You sort of feel like you want to take the brass canister out and hold it in your hands, all on this sort of delicious cream textured background. I absolutely, absolutely love it. And I still have the postcard that I bought at the Royal Academy of the lustre bowl on my desk in my study. All these years later, but I now have this on the wall as well. And I just wanted to say one final thing, which is that I think that a lot of us now quite like our artists sort of tortured and suffering. But with William Nicholson, what I really admire about him, and I actually admire it about people in general, is people who manage to make very difficult things look very easy. And that's what he does.
Calvert?
So my choices are slightly different to what I deal in. So I work at Benappi Fine Art in London, and we deal in Italian Old Masters. But the piece that I could never part with is actually a work by Dame Elizabeth Frink, who was really the greatest British sculptor of her generation in post-war Britain. And she came onto the scene in London in 1952 when she sold her entire graduate show to the Tate, and then represented at the age of only 21 the same year at the Venice Biennale, Britain. So a very interesting and fascinating young artist. I first experienced Frink when I was a very young boy because she moved to Dorset, which is where I grew up. It's a county in the south coast of England. And there was a collector there who was our neighbour, and he had this beautiful collection of her bronzes, which is what she's most famous for. And I just remember it was such a kind of visceral experience going in as a young boy into his garden and experiencing these bronzes and art, which for someone who grew up on a farm was quite strange and unusual, but it's something that I really meant so much to me, and sort of I think is one of the key moments in my life that made me want to be an art dealer and involved in the art world. So this work itself, so her graduate show was mainly bronzes of birds. She was fascinated in her early life with birds. So you have here this wonderful expression kind of looking into the sculptor's mind of how to depict different facets and angles of a bird in movement. So you have the wing and moving into the eye with these fast brushstrokes of watercolor, and then allowing the water to kind of pool and drip down the paper, which I find really fascinating. And I also love her choice of color. So you have this sky blue on the left side, and then the earthy brown tones of the bird on the right. Then on top of this, Frink is fascinating because while you're in the 50s and 60s in London, when there's a movement towards abstraction, but she stays totally true to her own creative process, which is another thing I love about certain artists. You know, they really do stick to what they love. And I think this is really key in her work. And she actually, at this point, she's moved to the south of France to detach herself completely, almost geographically, from the London art scene to focus on her production, which I find really interesting. But on top of this, in a more kind of poignant point, this was the first work of art that my wife and I bought together. We grew up together in Dorset, and so when this came up for auction, we saw it in an auction in Bonhams, and went there together. Like Cordelia and Patrick said, you have to really buy these things in person. It was, a really special moment for us, and every time I look at this on my wall at home, it's really does remind me of, a very special time. So, yeah. That.
Hello. So like Harry's piece, mine is very different to the type of pieces that I deal in my business. It's a pair of 16th century carved oak panels, but my two panels are carved on the left with the Tudor rose and on the right with the pomegranate, which represents Catherine of Aragon. So it was carved around 1509 to celebrate the marriage of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. At this point, Henry VIII hadn't been crowned. He was king, but he wasn't crowned for another 2 weeks after the marriage. So that kind of narrows the two panels down to the time between him becoming king, which was just a month earlier, and then being crowned 2 weeks after he got married. So that's why there's no crown on the panel. They're the most exceptional pieces of Tudor carving that I know of. I bought my panels at the Lepardo Antique Fair in Berkeley Square on the opening night. When I just set up my business, I had no money, but I had too much champagne and spent money that I didn't have. But I don't regret it because they're my favorite pieces. But it doesn't just represent the marriage, it also represents the hopeful fertility of Catherine, because the pomegranate is not only her family crest, as it were, and that of the Aragon court, but it's also a symbol of fecundity. So that's why there are 9 pomegranates carved. There's obviously the larger one in the centre, but then there are further pomegranates around the corners, which all represent the hope for a male heir to the throne of England.
I have a question already. May I? Because
Yes.
I know you. And Adam is so modest, he'd never say this, but Adam is the most beautiful, truly old, I don't know how old it is, house in Yorkshire that's been in House and Garden, all these magazines, which is full of beautiful Tudor furniture. And I wonder, and I know you started out as, this is what Helen didn't say, Adam started out before being a dealer, being a restorer. And there's so much delicious, to me, tactility in the material itself. I wonder if that's what
Yes,
drew
definitely.
you to it.
So then they're not the best pictures because they're the only pictures I had on my laptop.
Because they're not for sale.
They're not for sale, and they're in my house
How
in
do you
Yorkshire,
know?
and I was in London when I agreed to do the panel, so I had to search back through all of my old pictures to try and find something. But they are truly the best carving of the Tudor period.
I love that you said why you don't have a good image, because somebody said to me, oh, these are dealers. They're going to talk about the pictures they're flogging, that they can't sell. This is how you know they're not flogging them. There are no good pictures. I wanted to open it up for all of you. We're talking about the piece. You now have the pieces you'd never part with, for now. What's on your radar these days that maybe wasn't on your radar 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that might be a future piece you wouldn't part with? What are you looking for?
Well, specifically or generally as dealers? Okay.
I think, no, for yourself. You're a
For
collector
myself?
today.
Oh, I'm a collector.
You're a
today.
collector.
Well, actually, I would love to own more work by William Nicholson. I would love to own one of his sleek abstract landscapes. I would love a Whistler Nocturne on the Thames. I think that would be rather special. In fact, I would really like a Whistler Nocturne on the Thames. So if anybody here is not a budding collector, but an owner or a seller, come and find me afterwards. I think those are the two things right now that I would absolutely love to have. And if there was an unlimited budget and I could buy work by Velasquez, Rembrandt, having just been to Vienna to see the Rembrandt show out there, then I'd take some of those as well, Patrick.
I was with Adam the other day at Christie's, and we were looking at things, and I said, so what do you look for? He said, I don't look for, I just see what I find in the world. But I wondered for Harry and Adam, do you ever go to an auction view or to an art fair or to a gallery somewhere in the back of your head and say, I wish there's one thing I'm looking for? For me, there's this one lost study for Flaming June. Wherever I go, I think I maybe will find it for, $10. Is there anything that you dream of finding way down in your secret hearts?
I wrote my thesis on Wilhelm Hammershøi. When I was doing that, his works were still, this was sort of 10 years ago, and you could still it would probably cost you an average house price, but you could still buy them for, 300, 400,000. And I dreamed as a student going to Denmark. I used to go quite a lot and go through the small auctions and sort of search through and see maybe I might find one behind a mirror or something like that. And now they're, 6, 7, 8 million. So the prices have gone absolutely bananas. So I'm still looking. So
this is the thing you don't know about Harry, is that in addition to being in the old master world in the Italian Renaissance, finding misattributed masterpieces from the 15th, 16th century, Harry's other heart is in the Scandinavian art world. And you mentioned that, so I can't help asking, because to me it's one of the areas that's hottest right now, as you just said, because of the prices. Why do you think that is?
I think there's been some incredible work done by dealers. I see Rachel here. The Elwises have done an amazing job with Anna Boberg, and but also with different exhibitions by museums. So you've had some fantastic shows in Paris recently on Bruno Lillefort, on Harriet Backer. You've got a show coming up at the Met, which should be really exciting next year, on a Finnish artist called Helena Scherfbeck, who's absolutely incredible. And I think there's a really good moment in terms of diversifying collections in the US and in other museums and looking at different ways of understanding modernism. Modernism wasn't just a way, has always been taught as sort of French focused, that all these artists studied in Paris, and many of them did, but they also came from different areas of Europe. They came from Scandinavia, they came from Germany, and a lot of the Scandinavians studied in Berlin as well, in Rome. And so you have a really interesting mixture of these fascinating artists who then go on to change the narrative of modernism in their own countries. So it's an interesting moment for sure.
To me, I struggle. I think about that a lot, and I wonder why the prices have gone so high. And I think it's a combination of that 19th century, this serenity, the Scandinavian serene aesthetic that somehow, by total chance, or maybe not by total chance, fits our decorative tastes or aesthetic tastes in 2025. Adam, I wonder. It just occurred to me: does furniture follow that path? I mean, is Scandinavian furniture particularly, or is it like Biederm, other light sort of furniture, very much not expensive?
But lighter coloured furniture.
Yeah, like I think of Scandinavian furniture, and I'm not a furniture person, but I think of Scandinavian furniture painted white, and is that...
It's more desirable. Yeah,
Yes.
painted furniture is more desirable, I think, than wooden furniture. Although Angus Wilkie has just sold a pair of Biedermeier cabinets here at the show
Well done.
this week. So it's obviously coming back in fashion.
Do you think, is there a parallel between the decorative world of Scandinavian furniture paralleling an interest in Scandinavian painting, or do you not find that?
I mean, I think it's very interesting that these artists were also involved in design. So, the generation after sort of the 1880s, 1890s were, designing furniture. You had Gerhard Munter in Norway doing dragon style kind of furniture, which would then influence different Danish designers as well. So Hans Wegner and people like that later on. So I think, there's a definite connection, and there's a definite connection in terms of the simplicity of line and the economy of line of these artists, like Helena Scherfbeck, for example. And I think that certainly would have influenced designers throughout.
So, yes. Go right ahead, please. Do you know that was one of my questions? You're fabulous.
You planted him, surely.
The question is there a work that you missed buying at an auction or at a gallery that haunts you still?
It happens a lot. There's one that I really do remember, though, and it happened very early in my career. And I was working for a wonderful gallery on Bond Street called the Fine Art Society. And I sat at the front desk and I did mostly sort of answering the phone and things like that. But one of the jobs that I did have was to go through catalogues from across the country and the world and sort of circle things by artists that we dealt in. And obviously the directors were doing this in more detail, but it was just something to get me started. And there was a very small auction down in Canterbury on the south coast, and there was a painting by an artist called Algernon Newton. And Algernon Newton, his paintings, he's a very sort of esoteric British artist. And there was a painting, it was a coastal scene, and it was painted in 1939. And it was the coast looking towards the continent and these dark storm clouds coming in. So this is on the eve of war. So it had this sort of ominous feeling and this poignancy. And I took the catalogue upstairs to my managing director and put it on his desk, and he said, "Wow, that is fabulous. And we should go and have a look at it." And another director of the company was sort of floating around the same room. And he said, "Well, actually, I'm going down in that direction this weekend, so don't worry, I'll go and have a look, and I'll report back on Monday morning." And he did. And he said, "Very disappointing, very disappointing. It's perfectly well painted, but it's not one to buy. It's one to leave alone." And I was very junior, so obviously I didn't really have the confidence or the courage to go against him or to undermine him. And the managing director was in a similarly difficult situation because this was another director of the company. So he sort of said, "Well, actually, I ought to, we'll let it go." And it was bought by someone in this room
The plot thickens.
who has been mentioned before today, Rupert Mars, very cleverly spotted it, and he bought it. And he sold it to another dealer in London who sold it to your very own Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it isn't hanging, so I don't have that to suffer while I'm here. But it was a very, very good lesson for me early in my career, which is that you must trust your own gut. You must use your own eyes. And if you think something is interesting and powerful, you must go and see it. And that's still a golden rule for me today. So.
Absolutely. I wonder, as we maybe inspire some people in this room to find the pieces they'd never part with, what do you think are some of the areas that are overlooked or underrated? Where do you think people should be looking to buy things, whether online, at auctions, at art fairs, or what kinds of works do you think deserve more credit than they get today?
I would say if people should go looking in shops rather than online, I think we should really promote the shops still exist. I know a lot of business is done online, and I think it's fantastic. Most of my business happens online, but I do also have a bricks and mortar showroom. And I think in today's world, especially in London, where in the decorative arts and furniture world, so many dealers are closing down their permanent shops. I think that's a huge shame. So I would push people to do that.
Harry?
Well, I'm obviously going to say Nordic art, aren't I suppose. But I have this sort of passion that I can't sit still on. But I think that late 19th, early 20th century Nordic art is really fascinating. I think it's been totally written out of art history and is starting to be revised. And so you are uncovering these incredible artists who worked with Matisse, Fritz Taulo, for example, who invited Monet to Norway, and they painted snow and ice together in Norway in 1895. But all these stories and narratives that are really fascinating, and artists that compared to their French and German contemporaries, the price points are so much more accessible. So it's a really interesting moment to be looking in that area.
Are there any, many of us know the names of Hammershøi, etc., with big seven-figure prices. Are there any Nordic artists that we should be particularly attuned to? We don't want you to give away all your secrets, but just one or two. I don't want to give
away all my tricks. Yeah. But there's one artist that we showed last year for Master Drawings, which I really like, called Vino Blomstedt, who's a Finnish artist who was kind of adopted one summer by Gauguin. He met Gauguin in a cafe in Paris. They had a very drunken afternoon together, and Gauguin said, well, you've got to come and spend the summer with me in my studio. And they worked for a few months together, and then he went back to Finland and started doing these incredible landscapes, one of which we showed last year, and is now in the Minneapolis Museum, which is fantastic. But I think that's an artist that you can still buy at a very reasonable price point. So, yeah.
I would add, thinking about, my field is British art, and I'm amazed at how overlooked many 19th, even early 20th century British artists are. I remember last year during Master Drawings, during the winter show, the Met did a glorious hang of works on paper from their show, and the prices are absolutely reasonable for really, really, and it's amazing to me that these works are at the Met being appreciated, and I would encourage people to look at British art as well.
Totally
not just because you guys are here, I mean it. Yes, please. Oh.
Well,
Cordelia. What are the characteristics of the best clients, and what are the characteristics of the worst clients?
Well, I think our role as sort of ambassadors of historical art, and I say that as as opposed to contemporary art, is to spark curiosity. And if you can do that, and you meet somebody by doing that, through doing that at a fair like this or in an exhibition, and they trust you, and you can show them things and become their guide to the art market, but also you work together to start building a collection, and we're talking about collecting here today, so that's why I mention it, they can be the most wonderful relationships. You know, that is a dream client, somebody who shares an interest, likes what you do, trusts you, and lets you help them and sort of explore their ambitions as a collector. That's a dream client. A nightmare client is somebody who comes in, and this has happened to me at the gallery I used to work for, buys the entire exhibition on the first day, or comes to an art fair, and this happened to me last year. It's never happened to me in my career before, and bought the most expensive print on our stand, which was a Nevinson print, a First World War print. And everything in the art world, as you probably know if you collect, is really done with the shake of a hand. You should take people's addresses down and you trust that they are going to be good for what they've said they're going to be good for. So this person said that he wanted to buy this print on the first day, within the first hour of the fair. I put a red spot on it, so no one else inquired about it for the rest of the fair. And then when we sent him the due diligence forms after the fair, he said, actually, I've changed my mind. And that was a sort of boo hiss. That was terrible. So that's the worst sort of client, really. That's who you don't want.
Adam, it occurs to me that you have probably many clients who are designers rather than collectors directly. I mean, I don't know, but
Yes.
is that different from what Harry and Cordelia are explaining?
No, most of 50% of my pieces are sold to interior designers and decorators, I suppose. And I suppose the best clients are the ones that are allowed to make decisions on behalf of their clients, so they don't have to seek approval of pieces, because that can drag things out a bit. Pieces that are reserved for a long time are not that favourable. I like people that can make a decision fairly quickly about whether something works for them or not.
I have something from you on my desk, which I see every day. It's a rosewood letter rack from Asprey?
Asprey, yeah.
Asprey, and I see it every day, and I think of you, and it's what you said about going to shops. I think of not just the letter tray itself, but I think of Adam's wonderful shop and my friendship, and that's really, sometimes collecting isn't just about this thing itself, the object itself, it's about the world that it conjures around it. Last parting thoughts. Any other pieces of advice you'd give to people looking?
Get drunk at art fairs. And
Absolutely.
Essential.
Absolutely. This is what happens when you have English people on the panel.
Buy what you love. Buy what you love. You know, there's so much, when people talk about the art market and collecting, there's so much about trends and metrics. And of course, it's impossible to predict what's going to rise in value. That sort of thing, it's against the essence of what real collecting is actually about. And most great collectors are driven totally by passion. You know, whether that's for Pre-Raphaelite drawings or British Studio ceramics or stamps, it's passion that drives them on. And those are the greatest collections. And if you, say, go to big museums and it's the landscape paintings that you're drawn to, but you have a small flat and a small budget, as Patrick said, it is amazing what you can pick up for under $3,000, and you could start with landscape oil sketches. And as your life goes on and perhaps your budget goes up, you could buy landscape oil sketches by some of the greatest artists that ever painted. So there's a thread through your collection, but it's always been something that you've loved and that you've loved living with.
I agree with you, but I would add one thing to that. Buy what you love, of course, but if you don't know the answer to a question, at least know to whom you should pose the question, and be brave enough to ask the question and find someone that you trust in the field that you want to. And to me, the nightmare clients are the ones who ask your advice but don't actually want it. So ask the advice, find the right person to ask the question to, and you'll be on safe ground. Sorry, Harry, I think I interrupted.
No, I was just going to say, I think you just, as Cordelia said, you have to buy what you're drawn to, and I think that's then your taste, it develops with that, and also your eye and knowledge come afterwards. So like you were saying, you know, you start with something small. Works on paper, for example, are fantastic. You can buy amazing works on paper by really huge names for a fraction of the price that you would imagine their work goes for. And I think that's a fantastic place to start as a young collector. You can really find some beautiful, beautiful things on paper, especially from Patrick Bourne. But I think that's a great area to start with. And then, you know, as your time goes on, you can really develop your eye and taste through that. So, yeah.
Obviously, if we'll be back here, Helen will ask us back in 10 years, and we'll all have 5 different pieces we'd never part with, because we all grow and we all change. Are there any other questions from this beautiful crowd?
How sentimental are you all with the pieces that you have on display? So, you know, do you want them to go in theory to another collector someday, like you all, or museum, your children, your heirs, your whatever? You know, how precious are these things to you in the long run?
Very good question. I really always feel a pang of regret every time I agree to sell something. I think you engage with something so deeply when you're doing research on it, and you kind of slightly fall in love with it a little bit. And then it is very difficult to say goodbye, but you do need to pay the bills. So, but it's also wonderful to see those things and go and visit museums that you've sold works to and see it hanging in a place that you know it's going to be hopefully forever. So that's a wonderful feeling as well.
There's also an old saying from Ambroise Vollard, a famous Paris dealer. He said, dealers make the most money from the pictures they can't sell. Yes.
Adam, sticking with the panels, did the dealer at the La Parra Art Fair know what he was selling?
He did know what he was selling. I don't think he realized how interesting they were. He knew exactly what they represented and the period of them, but he didn't know how good the quality of the carving was. Yeah, he's also a young dealer, and he hadn't had them very long, and I think he had bills to pay. So he was in the habit of turning stock over very quickly and just taking a profit on things.
When you were talking about if you want to start a collection, and maybe the way to start, if you have a limited budget, is through buying works on paper, how critical is it today to have those authenticated properly? And are there a lot of fakes on the market of works on paper, watercolors especially?
Buy from people you trust. That's really the answer. Certain artists are known to be more highly faked. The safest one, by chance, is an artist called Paul Klee, who kept meticulous records throughout his whole life and numbered every work. So if there's a gap between number 342 and 344, you have a good chance. There are other artists who I would not touch by myself.
And I would add to that and say that, for example, when you come to a fair like this, or you go to TAFE Maastricht, or you go to Frieze Masters in London, everything on every booth has been rigorously vetted and authenticated. All of the dealers that are here at Master Drawings, they're top dealers. They wouldn't be offering things that they hadn't had properly authenticated, because it's more important than ever to people that things are right. And obviously there are cowboys in every industry, but I think that you can get quite a good sense of that these days. And so fairs, like the Winter Show, are a great place to come and buy things, because you know that a lot of the vetting committee, they'll either be other dealers, they're looking at things all day long, they know what they're looking at, but they're also people from museums. So it's been through a process, so you can trust what you're buying.
Have you had pieces in your personal collections that you cannot have waited to part with them?
That's the next panel, the piece we wish we could part with.
All of my stock I'd be very happy to sell. But no, there's not one particular piece. Everything that I buy, I love. So when it sells, I'm happy that it's sold, but I'm also happy to hang on to it until it finds the right home.
That's the thing. There are things that are out of fashion at the moment that are exquisitely beautiful, things that we possibly all have in stock, like a lot of 19th century landscape painting in the British field, and we do a lot with Scottish artists as well. And they're absolutely beautiful paintings. But right now, they're not a priority for younger collectors. They don't fit in with their interiors. People are much more interiors led now. So there are things that as dealers, we have in stock that maybe are not easy to find buyers for right now because they're out of fashion. But that's not to say they're not good. And you just hope that one day somebody comes through the door and
Buys Flaming June.
buys Flaming June.
You know, that's
Exactly.
That's the story.
Well, not to speak for all young people, but I think there has been a generational shift in collecting and in museums as well. And I think we're sort of a generation of Instagram. We're much more kind of image driven. And I think works you see now that sell well are immediately striking, give a real kick and an impact immediately as you walk into a room. I think that's what people are really looking for. And I think when you then connect that with an interesting narrative, then you have a fabulous piece that sells well. But I think people are really looking for very striking images, I would say. Yeah.
I think that's definitely true. Younger collectors who I deal with are really looking not at the history often as much, but on the power of the image itself. It could be because of Instagram, could be because of a lot of other factors. Especially, I think drawings, or really old master drawings, are a wonderful example of that because, as you said, young people are more driven by interiors and the whole ensemble of the thing, and drawings often fit better into contemporary interiors than paintings, and are more affordable.
But it's difficult because I deal in decorative antiques and furniture and things, so it's difficult to say.
But do you find that suddenly I see in fairs and auctions that suddenly the decorative arts and the fine arts, and those are such stupid words, but are suddenly much more on a par than they ever were, that people want to build a whole picture? Because I think we kind of feel that in the picture world. I wondered if that comes to your mind as well. It's funny because suddenly I find it much more prevalent.
Yeah, it's not really my world.
Any other questions? More? No?